What if it's only the developing countries? What if the developed world stays on its current trajectory and the developing world is able to boost total factor productivity by 1% from base? Well, then you see farm output price rise by 31%, okay, rather than the 116%. So these sound like relatively small changes with immense impact. Can we achieve this? And then down below are the footnotes, the assumptions of the model. It's a 0.7% per year baseline growth rate in the world population, distributed as you see across the developing world. Total factor productivity assumptions on the baseline are, again, these kind of lower than the historical rate of total factor productivity improvement. So, scary, but good news overall, I guess, or at least reason for hope. For the remainder of the talk, then, I'd like to turn to sub-Saharan Africa. I'll do that for a couple of reasons. One is the fact here that it's one of two regions of the world that has had persistently low progress against total factor productivity. Another reason is that it has by far the highest rate, the highest incidence of food insecurity in the world. And then the third reason for focusing on sub-Saharan Africa is that's where I work, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where I work. Within agriculture, we have 85% of our work is in sub-Saharan Africa, 15% in South Asia. So let's see if we can run down some of these issues that were raised as policy drivers of food insecurity or food security. There are three slides here that are going to show some of the dilemmas, the situation that agricultural productivity or agricultural R&D in sub-Saharan Africa has. If we look at that first line, the arable and permanent cropped area, we see that roughly speaking, sub-Saharan Africa is the same size or actually a little bit smaller than India or the United States. But what we see is that because of the geographic boundaries, we have nearly, 8 times as many public agricultural research agencies in Africa as we do in the United States, more than 3 times as many as they have in Africa for a similar geographic region. It's true that there is a far greater agroclimatic diversity in Africa than there is in sub-Saharan or in South Asia or the United States. But clearly it's a problem of fragmentation and the difficulty of achieving economies of scale and scope in agricultural research. The other thing that we notice is that there are actually more agricultural research scientists in sub-Saharan Africa than in either Asia or the United States. But the problem there is that only 25% of those scientists have a PhD versus 63% or 100% in the United States instance. And the spending, the amount of variable funds that each individual scientist has to work with is very, very low in sub-Saharan Africa. So we need to kind of look at this in a sober manner and say, is a system in which you have a large number of very small agricultural research agencies staffed with undertrained scientists with very little operating funds, is that going to lead us to a 1% increase in agricultural productivity growth that will be needed over the next 3 decades? Well, of course, the answer is no. Another aspect of that is that another R&D challenge for sub-Saharan Africa, you can't read the levels of these, so I want to just draw your attention to the instability of the trends. These are trends over time in agricultural R&D investments in 8 countries. And what you see is that in every single case, imagine yourself, put yourself in the chair of the research director in any of these countries, and realize that you don't know what your budget is going to be next year, and you have no idea what it's going to be 2 years from now. So go ahead and plan an innovation system based on the fact that you don't know what your budget is going to be. I think, interesting case is Nigeria. It's had great success in increasing research investment. They've also increased the percent of scientists that don't have a PhD during that time period. Why is that? Well, think about it. In the short term, you can't increase the number of PhD scientists in your country. It takes a long time to build up that capacity. You can increase funding. You're unlikely to get any additional research output that's of any great value. So that instability, I think that's a huge issue, and I think it's one that falls within the purview of donors and others working with governments to try and address. What we see here is that sub-Saharan Africa has a far lower rate of adoption of improved varieties, an indicator of the diffusion of technology into the hands of farmers. There's been a very laudable number of varieties released. Those are overwhelmingly releases of the international, the CGIR system, the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, but they're not getting to farmers. Again, another issue to be addressed. Now on to another of these policy issues that are so greatly important to food security. The continent of Africa is the most food self-sufficient of any continent, any region of the world. Okay? They're the least food secure by all measures, but they're the most food self-sufficient. There's very little food that's either exported or imported in Africa relative to the size of the population. So of course the balance there is that, excuse me, they're not food secure by any means because of the huge number of hungry people. And in fact, international trade is relatively minor. You have a very unusual geographic situation where it's not like Asia or Latin America where the majority of population now resides in coastal urban areas with great access to imports. A large share of the population of Africa is cut off by poor infrastructure. You have local markets, you have a very poor price integration across the continent. It certainly argues for regional integration of trade. And towards that end, you have 10 different regional economic communities. They're at various levels of integration. There are common currencies or a common currency in West Africa. There's movement in that direction towards tariff-free zones in other parts. In East Africa is moving very well. Those are hugely important activities. They're very long-term, and they're also very fragile. We can look back to 2008, this kind of inevitable, it seems, political policy response of putting on export bans once food prices peak. I think in some of the analyses, of course, you've seen blame a lot of the spike in 2008 relating to countries like India putting on export bans and isolating the world from the export supply of major suppliers in order to preserve internal price stability, to reduce internal price. A perfectly effective policy for suppressing internal prices in the short run. A disastrous policy in the long run because, of course, it takes away the incentives to invest of your own farmers. If every time prices go up, the government steps in and shoves them back down, that really isn't going to lead to a productive agricultural sector. So trade policies are immensely important. In terms of the role of the donors in sub-Saharan Africa, it's unique. You see that far higher levels of total investment in the region come from foreign sources, from donor sources. A rate of nearly 20% of investment in sub-Saharan Africa in the purple there, versus less than 5% in any other region of the world. So the role that the donors play is much enhanced in this region, and the region has been leading the way in a certain sense. The 2005, I believe, oh no, it must be 2003, a Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness declared that assistance should be led by countries rather than donors. It should be harmonized and coordinated, that donors should get together and coordinate among themselves, that they should harmonize with country priorities, that they should work with governments on a listed set of investment priorities for the sector, rather than going in there individually and identifying their own projects and their own special interests. This is a very, very long-run hope for improved effectiveness of donor assistance. The other side of this agreement, in addition to the donors getting on a different way of behaving, countries are committing to invest 10% of their government budget in agriculture, which would be doubling for most of the countries in Africa. Finally, my last slide. I hope I'm still on time here. Just to kind of review a couple of points that I've mentioned and maybe not had time to mention quite as well. Food insecurity, by my definition, is a chronic world problem. 1 billion people in the world are hungry. Immense progress was made during the Green Revolution period. It was spurred by more food being produced. You can think of a lot of contributors to that. It was good policy, it was expansion of area, it was higher input use, it was a new way of delivering agricultural research innovations, which is the international CGIAR system. But much depends on future productivity growth, and we're very uncertain as to what the future holds there. Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest incidence of food insecurity and certainly has special challenges for improving agricultural productivity. But there is hope. We saw that agricultural GDP growth is actually very strong in Africa over the last decade. It's an imperative to maintain sane trade regimes. That the absolute worst thing that can happen during times like these, when world food prices are disturbed, is that countries start closing off their borders and cutting back on their commitment to free trade. Huge uncertainties about a lot of these issues that will determine that food balance. Again, we're not sure what's going to happen with productivity expectations, climate change. We know some things about it, but there's a lot more that we don't know. We don't know how to deal with it. We don't know exactly where it's going to extract its highest toll or when. Land expansion potential, if you will, the land grabs issue that in Africa echoes a lot of the discussion that Professor Drysdale kind of raised yesterday about Chinese investments in Australia. And then water scarcity is an issue, again, that I didn't even touch on, but that, again, may be the most scarce resource of all. So with that, Connell, thank you very much for my time.